The first thing Talvek Aran noticed was the silence. She had served aboard warships for 11 years. She had heard the hum of engines in deep space, the clicking of Sarathi mandibles in crowded mess halls, the low vibration of weapons charging before battle. She knew what a ship sounded like when it was alive, and she knew with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in her chest that the silence pressing against the hull of the pale silence was not natural. It was the silence of something listening. She stood at her station on the intelligence deck, her forearms moving across the data panels in front of her. The screens showed nothing unusual: star charts, radiation readings, gravitational maps of the region ahead. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And yet Talvek could not shake the feeling that they had already made a terrible mistake. The Pale Silence was a Sarathi Dominion reconnaissance cruiser, one of the finest ships in the fleet. It was long and dark, shaped like a blade, built for speed and stealth. It carried a crew of 412, all of them loyal soldiers of the High Matriarchy. It was escorted by 6 smaller warships that flew in tight formation around it, like protective insects guarding their queen. Together they made up the 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group, and they had been sent to the edge of known space to do something that no one in the galaxy did anymore. They had been sent to probe human space. Talvek pulled up the mission briefing on her screen for the 20th time that day. The orders had come directly from the High Matriarchy, sealed with the mark of the Supreme Mother herself. The language was formal and cold, the way all Sarathi military orders were written. But Talvek could read the hunger between the lines. The Dominion was growing. In the last galactic cycle, it had consumed 17 starfaring civilizations, absorbing their worlds, their resources, their people. The Sarathi were not cruel about it. They were simply efficient. They saw the galaxy as a garden and themselves as the gardeners. Everything that grew in the garden either served the garden or was pulled out by the roots. But there was a part of the garden that the Sarathi had never touched, a region of the spiral arm that sat quiet and still, surrounded by warning buoys that broadcast in 12,000 languages. Human space, soul-claimed territory, the United Earth nations and their colonies, offers spread across a modest but well-defended stretch of stars. The matriarchy wanted to know if the humans were as dangerous as everyone said. And if they were not, the matriarchy wanted to know how quickly they could be consumed. Talvek closed the briefing and opened her intelligence files instead. This was her job. She was an analyst, trained to study enemy civilizations and find their weaknesses. She had done it for the Korvathi, the Dren, the Hollow Singers of Betelgeuse. She was very good at it. She could look at a species and see where it was soft, where it was brittle, where it would break. But the human files made her uncomfortable. It was not what the files contained, it was what they did not contain. There were thousands of pages of data on human biology, their history, their culture, their political structure. And the Sarathi had been gathering intelligence on humanity for over a century, but when it came to their military capabilities, the files became thin, uncertain, full of estimates and guesses and phrases like believed to possess and unconfirmed reports suggest. No one knew what the humans could actually do. And the reason no one knew was simple and terrible. Everyone who had gone to find out had either come back broken or had not come back at all. Talvek scrolled through the records. The Dreth Combine had sent a slaving fleet of 40 ships into human space 300 years ago. None returned. The Korvathi Empire had launched a full military invasion with 200 warships. They were neutralized in 11 minutes. The Bright Chorus, a hive mind species that had terrorized an entire galactic sector, now had attempted to infiltrate human space with a bioship the size of a small moon. It was found 3 weeks later, drifting in open space, completely hollow, every living cell inside it dead. And those were just the ones that had been documented. There were rumors of others, pirates who had strayed too close, smugglers who had ignored the warnings, research vessels that had gotten curious, all gone. All silent. The galactic community had a name for the region around human space. They called it the Quiet. And the unspoken rule of the galaxy, the one thing that every species from the elder races to the youngest spacefaring civilization agreed on, was simple. You do not enter the Quiet. Talvek understood this. She had studied it. She had written reports about it. And when she had been assigned to this mission, See, she had gone to Fleet Commandant Israel and said respectfully but firmly that this was a mistake. Israel had not listened. The Commandant was on the bridge now, standing at the center of the command platform, with her 6 legs planted wide and her thorax held high. She was old for a Sarathi warrior, her carapace scarred and dark with age, but her eyes were sharp and her mandibles were strong. She had conquered 3 civilizations for the matriarchy. She had earned her rank through blood and brilliance, and she was afraid. Not of the humans. Isrul was afraid of the matriarchy. She was afraid of returning empty-handed, of admitting that the Sarathi Dominion, the greatest military power in the known galaxy, was too frightened to even look at a young species that had only been in space for a few centuries. And that fear drove her forward like a whip, and it made her deaf to caution. "How long until we reach the buoy perimeter?" Israel asked, her voice clicking and sharp. The navigation officer checked his instruments. 6 standard hours, Commandant. "Good. Maintain course and speed. All ships in formation." Talvek watched from her station and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had made her objections. They had been noted and dismissed. Now all she could do was watch and record, and hope that the humans were not as terrible as everyone believed. The hours passed slowly. Talvek spent them reading. She went back through the human files again, looking for anything she might have missed. She studied their biology. They were soft creatures, warm-blooded, with only 2 arms and 2 legs. They had no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. By Sarathi standards, they were physically unremarkable. A single Sarathi soldier could tear a human apart in close combat without much effort. But the files also noted something else. Humans were persistent. They did not give up. They did not stop. When they were hurt, they healed. When they were knocked down, they stood up again. They had evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill them, a planet of earthquakes and volcanoes and predators and disease. And they had not just survived. They had conquered it completely. Every ocean, every mountain, every desert, every frozen wasteland. They had bent their entire world to their will through nothing but stubbornness and cleverness and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. And then they had looked up at the stars and decided to do the same thing. Talovek found that unsettling. The Sarathi were strong because they were many, because they bred fast and fought hard and overwhelmed their enemies with numbers and coordination. But humans were strong for a different reason. They were strong because they simply refused to be weak. "Commandant," the sensor officer said suddenly, "we are approaching the buoy perimeter." The bridge went quiet. Every officer looked up from their station. On the main display, the star map showed a line of small, blinking dots stretching across their path. The warning buoys. "On screen," Yisrael ordered. The display shifted to show the view ahead. They were small, the buoys, barely larger than a Sarathi escape pod. They floated in a long, even line, spaced exactly the same distance apart, stretching in both directions as far as the sensors could see. Each one pulsed with a soft blue light, and each one was broadcasting. The communications officer touched her panel, and the bridge filled with sound. A voice, calm and clear and utterly without emotion, speaking in perfect Sarathi. The pronunciation was flawless. The grammar was precise. It sounded like a Sarathi elder reading from a sacred text. "You are approaching human-administered space. Identify yourself and state your intentions. Unauthorized entry is prohibited. If you do not identify yourself, you are advised to change course immediately. There will be no second warning. This message repeats." The voice stopped. Then it started again, exactly the same, word for word. It was not a recording made by a Sarathi. It was a human system speaking their language with perfect fluency. And that small detail was somehow more frightening than anything Talvik had read in the intelligence files. They knew the Sarathi language. They spoke it perfectly, which meant they had studied the Sarathi, probably for a very long time, and the Sarathi had never even noticed. "Disable the broadcast," Isirul said. "It is noise, nothing more." The communications officer cut the sound, and silence returned to the bridge. But it was a different silence now, heavier, charged with something that Talvek recognized as fear. "Commandant," Talvek said carefully, "permission to speak." "Denied." Isrul did not even look at her. "All ships, maintain formation. We cross the perimeter in 2 minutes. Talvek felt her hearts beating fast, both of them pounding in her chest like drums. She looked around the bridge and saw the same fear in every officer's eyes. They were soldiers. They were trained. They were loyal. But they were also alive, and every living thing in the galaxy knew on some deep and primal level that crossing into human space was not something you did if you wanted to stay alive. The pale silence crossed the line. The buoys fell behind them, still blinking, still broadcasting their warning to empty space. Ahead there was nothing, just stars, just the cold, ordinary vacuum of deep space. But it did not feel ordinary. It felt like walking into a dark room and knowing with absolute certainty that something was already in there with you. Something that could see you perfectly, even though you could not see it at all. Sensor sweep, Israel ordered. Full spectrum. I want to know everything within 10 light years. The sensor officer worked his instruments. Talvek watched him, watched the way his upper arms trembled slightly as he adjusted the controls. The results came back quickly. Nothing, Commandant. No ships, no stations, no energy signatures. The area is completely empty. You see, Yisrael said, and there was something like triumph in her voice. Empty space. The humans rely on fear and reputation. There is nothing here. But Talvek was staring at her own screens, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The long-range sensors were picking up ghost signatures, faint echoes of energy that appeared and disappeared too fast to track. They were everywhere, scattered across the sensor grid like reflections on water. Each one lasted less than a heartbeat. Each one was in a different location. And each one, when Talvek ran the analysis, matched the energy profile of a ship. Not one ship, not 10 ships, hundreds of ships, maybe thousands, flickering in and out of existence around them like shadows, watching from dimensions that the Sarathi sensors could barely detect. They were surrounded. They had been surrounded from the moment they crossed the perimeter, maybe from before. Commandant, Talvek said, and this time she did not ask for permission. You need to see this. Israel turned, irritation on her face. But before she could speak, every light on the bridge flickered. Just for a moment, just long enough to notice. And in that moment of darkness, every screen on every station displayed the same thing. Two words written in the Sarathi military script that was used only for classified communications, in a script that no alien species should have been able to access. The word said, "You were warned." Then the lights came back, and the screens returned to normal, and the bridge of the pale silence was filled with the sound of 400 hearts beating very, very fast. Yisrael stared at the screens. Her mandibles opened and closed. For the first time since Talvek had known her, the Commandant had nothing to say. The silence pressed in around them, heavy and patient and vast, and the pale silence flew deeper into human space, carrying its crew towards something that none of them understood and all of them feared. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, something watched them come and waited. 3 days had passed since they crossed the buoy perimeter, and the pale silence had not been attacked. No weapons had been fired. No enemy ships had appeared. Nothing at all had happened, and that was the worst part. Talvek had not slept properly since the message appeared on the bridge screens. Neither had most of the crew. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they moved through the corridors, in the way conversations died the moment someone mentioned where they were. Fear had settled into the ship like a disease, quiet and spreading, and no amount of discipline could cure it. Israel pretended not to notice. The Commandant spent her time on the bridge, studying star charts and issuing orders with the same sharp confidence she always had. But Talvek noticed that Israel had stopped sleeping too. She noticed that the Commandant's mandibles clicked nervously when she thought no one was watching. She noticed that Israel had quietly ordered the weapons officer to keep all systems at full readiness at all times, even though they were supposedly in empty space with nothing to fight. The ghost signatures continued. Every few hours, Talvek's sensors would pick up another flicker of energy, another phantom ship appearing and disappearing at the edge of detection. She had stopped reporting them to Israel. The Commandant did not want to hear it. She had decided that the signatures were sensor glitches, natural phenomena, anything other than what they obviously were. They were being watched, they were being followed, and whatever was following them was making sure they knew it. On the morning of the 4th day, the sensor officer called Talvek to the bridge. His voice was strange when he spoke through the communicator. Not afraid. Exactly. Something beyond afraid. Something that had passed through fear and come out the other side into a kind of numb disbelief. You need to see this, he said. Everyone needs to see this. Talvek climbed to the bridge and stopped in the doorway. Every officer on duty was standing still, staring at the main display. Nobody was speaking. Nobody was moving. They just stood there, looking at what the sensors had found, and Talvek looked too, and she understood why nobody could speak. Ships, hundreds of ships, filling the space ahead of them like a forest of dead trees. They drifted in the vacuum, dark and cold and silent. Some were enormous, the size of small moons, their hulls scarred and torn. Others were smaller, frigate-sized vessels that had been twisted and broken into shapes that no longer made sense. They came in every design, every style, every material. Talvek recognized Korvathi dreadnoughts with their distinctive blade-shaped prows. She saw Dreth Combine slave ships, their cargo bays blown open and empty. She saw vessels from species she could not identify, designs she had never seen before, ships from civilizations that had been erased so completely from the galaxy that not even their names survived. The graveyard. She had read about it in the classified files, the ones that the matriarchy had marked as unconfirmed intelligence. Rumors from deep space traders and frightened diplomats. A place where the humans kept the remains of every fleet that had ever crossed into their space uninvited. A monument and a warning, floating in the dark for anyone foolish enough to come looking. The rumors were true, and the reality was worse than any of the stories. How many? Yisrael asked. Her voice was steady, but Talbot could hear the strain beneath it. The commandant was holding herself together through pure willpower. Over 600 vessels confirmed, the sensor officer said, scattered across an area of approximately 2 cubic light hours. Some of them are very old, centuries old. Others are more recent. He paused. Commandant, some of them are Sarathi. The bridge went very still. What? Yisrael said. 3 vessels. Sarathi design, military configuration. They match the profile of the Long Watch Squadron that disappeared in this region 90 years ago. The one that was officially listed as lost to a navigational error. Talvek remembered the Long Watch. Every Sarathi child learned about it. 30 brave soldiers who had ventured into the unknown and never returned. Frana, the matriarchy had told the people that they were lost to the dangers of deep space, that it was a tragedy, that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. But the truth, the real truth, was floating right there in front of them, dark and dead among the ruins of 100 other foolish expeditions. The matriarchy had lied. They had known what happened to the Long Watch. They had known, and they had sent Yisrael and the 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group anyway. Talvik looked at Yisrael and saw the same realization in the commandant's eyes. The matriarchy had not sent them to gather intelligence. They had sent them to test whether the humans were still paying attention. They were bait. Nothing more. Commandant, Talvik said quietly, we should turn back. Yisrael said nothing for a long moment. Then she straightened her thorax and clicked her mandibles together with a sharp sound. We will investigate. Prepare a boarding team. I want to know what happened to those ships. Talvek wanted to argue. She wanted to scream, but she was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders, so she assembled a team of 12 and took a shuttle across the dark space between the pale silence and the nearest derelict. They chose a Korvathi dreadnought, one of the larger vessels in the field. It was massive up close, nearly 3 kilometers long, its armor plating thick and heavy. The Korvathi had been famous for their warships. They built them to last, designed them to take punishment that would tear other vessels apart. This ship looked like it could have fought for 1,000 years, but it was dead, completely, absolutely dead. No power, no heat, with no atmosphere. It drifted in the vacuum like a stone at the bottom of an ocean, and when Talvek's shuttle docked at the nearest airlock, the sound of the magnetic clamps engaging echoed through the hull like a heartbeat in an empty chest. The boarding team entered in full vacuum suits, weapons drawn, lights cutting through the absolute darkness inside the ship. The corridors were intact. That was the first thing Talvek noticed. There was no battle damage, no scorch marks from energy weapons, no breaches in the hull, no signs of any kind of conventional attack. The ship had not been destroyed. It had simply been turned off. "This does not make sense," muttered Sergeant Krail, the team's combat specialist. He was a big Sarathi, heavily armored, with scars across his carapace from a dozen campaigns. He was not easily frightened. But his voice was tight and uncertain as he swept his weapon light across the empty corridor. "Where is the damage? Where is the fight?" "There was no fight," Talvik said. She could feel it in the stillness of the ship. Whatever had happened here had not been a battle. It had been something else entirely. They found the crew on the command deck. They were still at their stations, every one of them. The captain in her command chair, the weapons officer at his console, the navigation team at their instruments. They were perfectly preserved, encased in some kind of amber-colored substance that had hardened around them like glass. Their bodies were intact. Their uniforms were pristine. Their hands were still reaching for controls, still frozen in the middle of whatever they had been doing when it happened. And their faces. Montalvik would never forget their faces. The Korvathi were a reptilian species, cold-blooded and hard-scaled, not given to strong facial expressions. But every single crew member on that bridge wore the same expression, burned into their features like a brand. Their eyes were wide, their mouths were open, their claws were extended, gripping their consoles so hard that the metal had bent under the pressure. They were terrified. They had been frozen in the moment of their greatest fear, preserved forever in that instant of absolute horror, and whatever they had seen in that last moment was still there in their eyes, staring out through the amber like a warning to anyone who came after. Krail took a step back. "What did this to them?" Talvik did not answer. She was looking at the ship's data console. Unlike the crew, the computer systems were not encased in amber. They were simply dead, unpowered, but structurally intact. She connected her portable data unit and began pulling whatever information remained in the storage banks. Most of it was corrupted. Time and power failure had degraded the files beyond recovery. But she found fragments, pieces of the ship's log, sensor readings from the final hours. She pieced them together as the rest of the team searched the ship, and the picture that formed made her feel sick. The Korvathi fleet had entered human space with 200 warships, 200 of the most powerful vessels their empire had ever built, crewed by their best soldiers, armed with weapons that had conquered a dozen worlds. They had come to take human space by force, confident in their strength, and certain that no young species could stand against the might of the Korvathi Empire. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Talvik read the sensor logs 3 times to make sure she was not making a mistake. 11 minutes. From the first human contact to the last Korvathi ship going dark. 11 minutes for 200 warships to be neutralized. And the logs showed something else. Something that turned the cold in Talvik's blood to ice. The humans had not used the same method twice. Each ship had been disabled in a different way. Some had their power systems shut down remotely, as if the humans had reached inside and simply flipped a switch. Others had their weapons dismantled at the molecular level, the components dissolving into dust while the rest of the ship remained untouched. Others had been wrapped in fields that stopped all movement, either freezing everything aboard in an instant. Every method was tailored to the specific ship. Every approach was designed for that particular vessel's systems, that particular crew's physiology. The humans had not just beaten the Korvathi fleet. They had studied each ship individually, understood it completely, and then taken it apart with the precision of a surgeon removing a diseased organ. This was not warfare. This was something beyond warfare. This was a species that had turned defense into an art form so advanced that it did not even look like fighting anymore. It looked like a natural disaster. It looked like the universe itself had decided that the Korvathi fleet should stop existing, and the universe had made it so. Talvik downloaded everything she could and ordered the team back to the shuttle. They moved quickly through the dark corridors, their lights bouncing off the walls, their breathing loud in their helmets. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They had all seen the same thing, and they all understood the same truth. The humans did not fight wars. They ended them, completely, instantly, and with a precision that suggested they had been planning for each specific enemy long before that enemy even decided to attack. Back on the pale silence, Talvik presented her findings to Isrul. She laid out the data clearly and carefully. The graveyard, the Korvathi logs, the 11 minutes, the tailored methods. She explained what it all meant, and she watched the commandant's face as the reality of their situation settled over her like a shroud. "We need to leave," Talvek said. "Commandant, there is nothing to gain here. The humans are beyond anything we can challenge. The matriarchy must be told the truth." Israel was quiet for a long time. She stood at the viewport of her private quarters, looking out at the field of dead ships, and Talvek could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride against fear, duty against survival. The commandant was a warrior, born and bred, and every instinct she had told her to stand her ground, to push forward, to never show weakness. But she was also intelligent, and she had seen the evidence. "If we return empty-handed," Israel said slowly, "the matriarchy will have us executed. You know this." "If we continue forward," Talvek replied, "the humans will not need to execute us. We will simply stop existing." Israel turned from the viewport. Her eyes were hard. Her mandibles clicked once, twice, 3 times. Then she straightened and walked past Talvek toward the bridge. "All ships," she ordered, "continue on course. Increase speed to maximum." Talvek closed her eyes. She had tried. She had done everything she could, and now they were going to fly deeper into the dark, past the graveyard of every fool who had come before them, toward whatever waited at the heart of human space. She returned to her station and found a message waiting on her personal communicator. It should have been impossible. The communicator was a closed system, encrypted with Sarathi military codes, connected only to the ship's internal network. No external signal should have been able to reach it. But there it was, clear and simple, written in Sarathi script so perfect it could have come from a matriarchy scribe. It said, "You have seen what happens. You can still leave." Talvek stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked up at the main display, where the stars ahead burned cold and bright, and she wondered if the humans were offering her a kindness or showing her exactly how deep inside their systems they already were. She wondered if there was any difference. The pale silence flew on, and the dead ships of the graveyard fell away behind them, and the silence ahead grew deeper and wider and more absolute. And Talvek Aran sat at her station and waited for whatever came next, because there was nothing else she could do. The humans had given their warning. They had shown the evidence. They had even offered a way out. And the Sarathi, because they were proud and because they were afraid of the wrong things, had chosen to keep going. Somewhere in the darkness, somewhere the silence shifted. Not louder, not softer, just different. Patient in a new way, as if something vast and invisible had taken a slow breath and was now very carefully beginning to pay attention. Long before the Sarathi Dominion existed, long before the Korvathi built their first warship or the Dreth Combine took their first slave, humanity made first contact with the galaxy. It did not go well. The year was 2089 by the human calendar. A colony ship called the New Dawn had settled on a green and gentle world in a system the humans named Quran, after one of their ancient myths about the passage between life and death. It was a small colony, barely 10,000 people. Farmers, scientists, teachers, children. They had traveled for decades through the void to find a new home, and they had found one. And for 3 years they lived there in peace and built something beautiful. Then the Dreth Combine came. The Dreth were slavers. That was their entire economy, their entire culture, their entire reason for existing. They moved through the galaxy like a plague, falling on weaker species and taking everything. Their ships arrived in the Karen system without warning, blocked all communications, and landed troops on the surface before the colonists even understood what was happening. What followed was documented in the Dreth's own records, because the Dreth were proud of their work and kept detailed accounts of every harvest. They separated the colonists by age and health. The strong were taken for labor. The skilled were taken for specialized work. The children were taken for breeding stock, to be raised in Dreth facilities and trained for obedience. The old and the sick, those who had no economic value, were processed. That was the word the Dreth used, processed. It meant something that Talvek did not want to think about too carefully. The colony of Karen was emptied in 6 hours. 10,000 human lives scattered across Dreth space like seeds thrown into a fire. The buildings were stripped for materials. The gardens were burned. The New Dawn, the ship that had carried those people across the stars to their new home, was cut apart for scrap metal. Earth did not learn what had happened for almost a year. Communications were slow in those early days, and the Dreth had destroyed the colony's relay stations. When the next supply ship arrived and found nothing but ash and empty buildings, and the humans did not understand at first. They thought it was a natural disaster, an accident, a disease. Then they found the Dreth records. The Dreth, in their arrogance, had not bothered to hide what they had done. They had logged the harvest of the Karen colony the same way they logged every other harvest. And those logs were transmitted through their communication networks without any encryption, because who would care? The humans were a small, weak, newly spacefaring species. They had no allies. They had no fleet. They had nothing. Earth received the Dreth logs and read them and understood exactly what had been done to 10,000 of their people. And something changed in the human species that day. Something fundamental and permanent and terrible. The grief came first. A grief so vast and so deep that it touched every human alive. On every world, in every station and ship and habitat, 10,000 names read aloud on every broadcast channel. 10,000 faces shown on every screen. The humans mourned their dead the way they did everything, completely and without restraint. And the galaxy, which was not paying much attention to the small species on the edge of the spiral arm, did not notice the mourning or what came after it. What came after it was the rage. Not the hot, burning, reckless rage that consumed other species when they were wronged. Human rage was different. It was cold. It was patient. It was the rage of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history being hunted by things bigger and faster and stronger than itself, and had survived not by being more powerful, but by being more determined, more clever, more willing to endure. The humans did not immediately build a war fleet and charge into Dreth space for revenge. That was what the Dreth expected, if they expected anything at all. That was what most species would have done. Instead, the humans went quiet. For 50 years, humanity turned inward. They sealed their borders. They stopped exploring. They stopped trading. They stopped communicating with the few alien species they had made contact with. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like the humans had retreated into their shell, frightened by their first encounter with the reality of interstellar civilization. Some species laughed about it. Others forgot about the humans entirely. But inside that shell, behind those sealed borders, humanity was transforming itself. In it, they poured every resource they had into two things: understanding the galaxy and making themselves impossible to destroy. They studied every species they could gather data on. Their intelligence networks, even in those early days, were extraordinary. They sent probes so small they could not be detected by any known sensor technology. They intercepted communications. They mapped the political structures and military capabilities and cultural weaknesses of every civilization within 1,000 light years. And they built. They built weapons that did not look like weapons. They built defenses that did not look like defenses. They built systems so advanced that even the elder races, species that had been traveling between stars for millions of years, would later look at them with something close to awe. 50 years after Karen, could the Dreth Combine send another fleet to human space, expecting to find more easy prey? The fleet was never heard from again. Not a single ship returned. Not a single signal escaped. The Dreth sent scouts to investigate, and those scouts disappeared too. They sent a full armada, the largest military force they had ever assembled, and that armada vanished as completely and as silently as smoke and wind. The Dreth Combine collapsed within a decade, not because the humans attacked them. The humans never attacked anyone. The Dreth collapsed because they could not replace the ships and soldiers they had lost, and because the rest of the galaxy, seeing what had happened, began to wonder if the humans might come for them next, and stopped doing business with the Dreth out of pure self-preservation. But the humans did not come for anyone. They stayed behind their borders. They put up their warning buoys, and they published a single document, transmitted on every frequency in every language they had learned, which they called the Solarian Doctrine. Talvek had read the doctrine many times. She had it memorized. It was short, clear, and absolute. All beings are welcome in human space who come in peace and announce themselves. Those who enter uninvited will receive one warning. Those who continue after the warning will be classified as an existential threat to the human species. There will be no proportional response to an existential threat. There will be only the complete elimination of the threat. 4 rules. Simple enough for a child to understand. And behind those 4 rules, the entire weight of a species that had decided, collectively and permanently, that what happened at Karen would never happen again. Not to their people. Not to anyone under their protection. Not ever. The galaxy learned to respect the doctrine, not because they admired it, but because they feared it. The warning boys broadcast in 12,000 languages because the humans had taken the time to learn 12,000 languages. The graveyard existed because the humans kept the evidence of every violation as a reminder. And the silence around human space was not empty. It was full of systems and watchers and weapons that no one outside of human space fully understood. Talvek thought about all of this as the pale silence flew deeper into the dark. She thought about Karen. She thought about the 10,000 people who had been taken from their homes and broken apart for profit. She thought about the cold, patient, unstoppable rage that had followed. And she thought about how the Sarathi Dominion, in its hunger and its pride, had decided to poke that rage with a stick. She was in her quarters when the ship's systems began to fail. It started small. The lights in the corridor outside her door flickered. Then the environmental controls in her section reset themselves, dropping the temperature by several degrees before returning to normal. Then her personal terminal shut down and restarted on its own, and when it came back online, there was a file on her desktop that she had not put there. It was a crew manifest, her crew manifest. Every name on the pale silence, with their rank, their posting, their homeworld, their family connections. Next to each name was a note written in perfect Sarathi, listing that crew member's medical conditions, personal fears, and psychological profile. The humans had not just studied their ship, they had studied every single person aboard it. They knew Krail's old combat injury that sometimes made his left arm seize up. They knew the navigation officer's fear of confined spaces. They knew that the communications officer had a daughter back on the homeworld who was about to enter her first breeding cycle. They knew everything, and they had placed this file on Talvek's terminal, not to threaten, but to show her exactly how thoroughly they had been watching. It was a message that said, "We see you, all of you, completely." Talvek took the file to Yisroel. The commandant read it in silence. Her mandibles did not click, her eyes did not blink. She simply read, and when she was finished, she set the datapad down on her desk and stared at it for a long time. "They are trying to frighten us," Yisroel said finally. "They are succeeding," Talvek replied. "Fear is a weapon. It can be used by anyone. It does not mean they have the strength to back it up." "Commandant, with respect, the graveyard suggests otherwise. 600 ships from dozens of species, all neutralized, all preserved as evidence. The Kravathi fleet destroyed in 11 minutes. The Dreth Combine erased from history. These are not the actions of a species that relies on bluffing. The Korvathi were weak. The Dreth were arrogant. We are Sarathi." Yisroel stood and walked to her viewport, looking out at the stars. "The matriarchy did not send us here to be frightened by ghost stories and old wrecks. Hi, we have our orders." Talvek wanted to say that the matriarchy had sent them to die. She wanted to say that Israel's pride was going to kill them all. She wanted to grab the commandant and shake her until she understood that they were not dealing with an enemy that could be measured in ships and soldiers and firepower. They were dealing with something else entirely, something that had been preparing for this moment for 300 years. But she said none of these things, because even as she stood there, the ship shuddered. It was not a violent shudder. It was gentle, almost delicate, like a hand brushing across the hull. But it ran through the entire ship, from bow to stern, and every system on every deck flickered in unison. Then the main engines went offline. Not in the way engines fail, with alarms and warnings and emergency protocols. They simply stopped. One moment the pale silence was moving under its own power, and the next it was drifting, carried forward by momentum alone. The backup systems activated automatically, but they were running at half capacity, and the ship's AUI reported something that should have been impossible. The engine shutdown had been initiated from within the ship's own systems. The command codes used were Sarathi military codes, current and valid, but they had not been entered by anyone aboard. Something outside the ship had reached into their most secure systems and used their own codes to turn their engines off. Then the weapons went dark, then the shields, then the communications array. One by one, system by system, the pale silence was being dismantled from the inside, when its own technology turned against it by an invisible hand that knew every code, every protocol, every weakness. Isrul stood on the bridge and watched her ship die around her, and for the first time Talvek saw real fear in the commandant's eyes, not the controlled, managed fear of a soldier facing a known enemy. This was the raw, primal terror of a creature realizing that it was completely and utterly helpless. "Get the engines back online," Isrul ordered. Her voice cracked on the last word. "We cannot, Commandant," the engineering officer said. "The shutdown codes are cycling too fast. Every time we override one, another activates. It is like fighting our own shadow." The escort ships reported the same thing. Every vessel in the fleet was experiencing the same systematic shutdown. The humans were inside all of them. Who had been inside all of them? Perhaps from the very beginning. Then the lights on the bridge went out, and in the darkness, a single screen activated. It showed text, written in the formal diplomatic script of the Sarathi High Matriarchy, the same sacred calligraphy that was used only for communications between the Supreme Mother and her closest advisors. The text said, "Your systems now belong to us. Your weapons are offline. Your engines are disabled. Your communications are blocked. You are not in danger. Your crew will not be harmed. But you need to understand something very clearly. Everything that is happening to your ship right now, we could have done the moment you crossed the buoy perimeter. We waited because we wanted to give you every chance to turn back on your own. You did not take those chances. Wait, so now we will show you what happens next. Continue forward and you will meet us face to face. We strongly suggest you reconsider, but the choice, as always, is yours." The message faded. The lights came back on, and slowly, one by one, the ship's systems restarted. Engines, weapons, shields, communications. Everything returned to full function, as if nothing had happened. It had been a demonstration, a gentle one. A reminder that the humans could take everything away whenever they wanted, and that the only reason the Sarathi fleet still existed was because the humans had chosen to allow it. Isrul stood in the center of the bridge, surrounded by her frightened officers, and Talvek could see the commandant's mind working behind her eyes. The pride was still there, the stubbornness, the refusal to yield. But there was something else now, something that Talvek recognized because she felt it herself. The understanding that they were not the hunters here. They never had been. From the moment they had crossed the buoy perimeter, they had been walking into a trap so vast and so patient that they could not even see its edges. And the thing that had set the trap was not angry. It was not cruel. It was simply waiting, with infinite patience and absolute certainty, for them to make their choice. Isrul turned to Talvek. Their eyes met. "Commandant," Talvek said softly. "Please." Isrul's mandibles worked silently. Then the commandant straightened, turned to the navigation officer, and gave her order. "Full speed ahead. Set course for the nearest human colony world." The bridge was silent. Talvik felt something inside her break, quietly and cleanly, only like a bone snapping under too much weight. "Commandant," she said one last time, "they will not warn us again." Isrul did not look at her. "I know," she said, and the pale silence flew on. The stars changed. Talvek noticed it first as a feeling, a subtle shift in the quality of the space around them, as if the vacuum itself had become denser, heavier, more aware. Then she checked her instruments and saw that the feeling was not her imagination. The fabric of space-time in this region had been altered, modified, engineered with a precision that made the Sarathi's best scientists look like children drawing pictures in sand. They had entered the inner threshold of human space. The buffer zone was behind them. The graveyard was behind them. The warnings were behind them. Ahead lay the worlds where humans actually lived. One out of the colonies and stations and habitats of a species that had turned its own corner of the galaxy into something that no one fully understood. And then the trap closed. It happened without sound, without drama, without any of the spectacle that the Sarathi expected from a military engagement. One moment the Pale Silence and its escort ships were moving at full speed through normal space, and the next moment they were not moving at all. The engines were still running. The power was still flowing. Every system on the ship reported normal function, but the ship was stationary, fixed in place as absolutely as if it had been welded to the universe itself. The escort ships reported the same thing. All 6 of them locked down, frozen, held in place by something that the sensors could not even detect. There was no field, no barrier, with no visible force. Space itself had simply decided that the Sarathi fleet could not move, and that was that. Dimensional anchors, Talvek whispered to herself. She had read theories about them in the most speculative human technology assessments, devices that could lock a region of space-time, making it impossible for anything within that region to move, accelerate, or escape. The theories had been classified as unlikely. Impossible, some analysts had said. No species in the galaxy had the ability to manipulate space-time at that level. The analysts had been wrong. Israel was on the bridge, gripping her command console with all 4 arms. She was issuing orders rapidly, her voice sharp and fast. But there was an edge to it now that Talvek had never heard before. Not panic, not yet, but something close. Or the Commandant was a warrior who understood physics and tactics and military strategy, and everything that was happening right now existed outside all 3 of those categories. All weapons, target the source of the holding field, Israel ordered. There is no source, Commandant, the weapons officer said. His voice was shaking. The field has no origin point. It is everywhere. It is the space itself. Then target anything, everything. I want a full spread, all directions. Commandant, we cannot fire. The weapons are online, but the targeting systems are reporting that there are no valid targets. The systems believe we are alone. Israel slammed her fists on the console. We are not alone. No, said a voice that did not belong to any Sarathi. You are not. Every head on the bridge turned. Ikra, the main communications channel, had activated on its own, and through it came a voice speaking in perfectly accented Sarathi. But it was not the flat, mechanical voice of the warning buoys or the text messages that had appeared on their screens. This voice was warm, alive. It belonged to a real person, and it carried a tone that Talvek found more unsettling than anything she had encountered so far. The voice was kind. This is Commander Ilara Mwangi of the United Earth Nations vessel. Quiet resolve, Warden class, operating under the authority of the Solarian Defense Compact. I am addressing Fleet Commandant Israel of the Sarathi Dominion 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group. Commandant, I would like to speak with you. A ship appeared on the sensors, just one. It seemed to materialize from nothing, as if it had been there all along and had simply chosen to become visible. It was small, absurdly, insultingly small. Where the Pale Silence was a kilometer-long blade of dark metal and heavy armor, the human vessel was compact and sleek, perhaps 100 meters from bow to stern. It looked more like a private yacht than a warship. It had no visible weapons, no heavy armor plating, no shield projectors that the Sarathi sensors could identify. It was, by every military metric the Sarathi used, not a threat, and yet it had stopped them. One small ship had frozen an entire fleet in place, and it sat there now, floating in the void in front of them, calm and still and utterly unafraid. I count one vessel, the sensor officer said. His voice was barely a whisper. Crew complement, 9. 9 crew members aboard. The bridge went silent. Each 7 Sarathi warships, over 2,000 soldiers, enough firepower to crack a planet's crust, and across from them, one small ship with 9 humans inside it. Commandant Israel, the voice of Commander Mwangi continued, I know this situation is frightening, and I want to assure you that neither you nor your crew are in danger. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to talk. May I have your attention for a few minutes? Israel stared at the display showing the tiny human vessel. Her mandibles worked slowly, clicking and grinding. Then she activated the communication channel. You are addressing a commandant of the Sarathi Dominion. You will explain how you are holding our ships. Of course, Mwangi said. Your fleet is being held in a localized space-time stabilization field. It is temporary and harmless. Your engines, your systems, your life support, everything is functioning normally. The field simply prevents movement. Think of it as a pause button. When our conversation is finished, the field will be released and you will be free to move. Free to move where? That depends on you, Commandant. I have an offer to make, and I hope you will consider it carefully. There was a pause. Talvek could hear her own blood pumping through her body. The bridge was so quiet that she could hear the individual breaths of every officer around her. I know why you are here, Mwangi continued. The High Matriarchy of the Sarathi Dominion ordered this reconnaissance mission 47 standard days ago. The order was issued by Supreme Mother Kathala during a closed session of the Inner Council. Councilors Bryn, Ossel, and Tarek voted in favor. And our councilors Morath and Vale voted against. The mission was classified at the highest level of Sarathi military secrecy. Another pause. Israel's face had gone completely still. The information Mwangi had just recited was known to perhaps a dozen beings in the entire Sarathi Dominion. It was the kind of intelligence that should have been impossible for any outsider to possess. I also know, Mwangi continued gently, that intelligence officer Talvek Oran has argued against this mission from the beginning and has been overruled. I know that Sergeant Krail has a degenerative condition in his left thoracic nerve cluster that has not been reported to medical. I know that your navigation officer, Lieutenant Piss, he keeps a pressed flower from his homeworld in his personal locker and looks at it every night before he sleeps. The navigation officer made a small, strangled sound, his upper arms wrapped around his body, a gesture of self-protection that Talvek had not seen from a grown Sarathi since childhood. I tell you these things not to frighten you, Mwangi said. I tell you so that you understand the depth of our knowledge and the sincerity of what I'm about to say. We have watched you since before you left Sarathi space. We knew you were coming before your commandant received her orders. We have had plenty of time to prepare, and what we have prepared, Commandant Yisrael, is not a battle. It is a choice. Mwangi paused. When she spoke again, her voice was even softer. Here is your choice. Power down your weapons. Allow my ship to escort you back to the border of human space. Your crew will not be harmed. Your ships will not be damaged. You will be returned safely with all personnel and equipment, and you will go home. You will tell the matriarchy what you have seen and experienced, and you will tell them that humans are not their enemy unless they insist on making us one. And if I refuse? Israel asked. Her voice was quiet. Then I will be very sorry, Commandant, because you seem like a person of honor, and your crew seem like good people who are far from home, and none of you deserve what happens next. But if you refuse, you will not be going home. You will join the graveyard. And 50 years from now, some other fleet from some other species will find your ships drifting in the dark and wonder what happened to you. And they will know exactly what happened, because the same thing always happens. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Talvek looked at Yisrael. The commandant was standing very still, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the small human ship floating before them. The fear was there. Talvek could see it, but so was something else. Something harder and darker. The pride of a Sarathi warrior who had never retreated. The stubbornness of a creature who would rather die than bend. And the shame, the terrible, crushing shame of being helpless in front of her crew. Of being shown clearly and undeniably that everything she believed about Sarathi strength and superiority was a lie. That the mighty Sarathi Dominion, conqueror of 17 civilizations, was nothing more than an insect buzzing at the edge of a giant's garden. Commandant, Talvek said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Please, take the offer. Yisrael turned to look at her. Their eyes met, and Talvek saw the moment the commandant's pride won the war against her reason. It was like watching a door close. Something shut down behind Yisrael's eyes. Something that might have been wisdom or caution or the simple desire to live. And what replaced it was the cold, hard certainty of a being who had decided that death was better than surrender. All ships, Yisrael said. Open fire. The weapons officer hesitated, just for a heartbeat, his hands hovering over the controls, his eyes wide with the understanding of what was about to happen. Then training took over, as it always did, and he pressed the controls and every weapon on every Sarathi ship fired at once. The void lit up. Energy beams. Plasma torpedoes. Kinetic rounds accelerated to a fraction of light speed. Everything the Sarathi fleet had, every weapon designed to crack armor and shatter shields and burn worlds, unleashed in a single massive volley aimed at the small, quiet ship floating before them. The shots never arrived. They simply stopped, frozen in space, hanging motionless in the void between the Sarathi fleet and the quiet Resolve, suspended by the same impossible technology that held the ships themselves. Hundreds of projectiles and energy beams, enough firepower to level a continent, fixed in place like insects in amber. The quiet Resolve had not moved. It had not raised shields. It had not fired a single shot in return. It sat there calm and still, surrounded by the frozen fury of the Sarathi fleet, and it did not even seem to notice. "That was your answer," said Commander Mwangi. Her voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, only a deep and genuine sadness. "Now here is ours." The escort ships went dark. It happened in a single heartbeat. 6 warships, each carrying over 200 crew, simultaneously lost all power. Engines, weapons, shields, life support, everything. They went dark and cold and silent, drifting in the void like the dead ships in the graveyard. And on the pale silence's sensors, their status indicators changed from green to black in one horrible instant. But their life signs remained. Talvek checked frantically, her hands flying across her instruments, and yes, there they were. Every crew member on every escort ship was alive. Their hearts were beating. Their lungs were breathing. They had not been killed. Or their ships had simply been switched off around them, as quickly and as cleanly as someone blowing out a candle. Only the pale silence remained active. Only the flagship, Isserul's ship, still had power and light and air. And Talvek understood why. The humans had left it active on purpose. They wanted Isserul to see. They wanted her to sit on her bridge, surrounded by her dead fleet, and understand exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it. The frozen weapons fire dissolved. The energy beams and torpedoes and kinetic rounds simply faded away, broken down at the molecular level, returning to the void as harmless particles. In seconds, there was no trace that anyone had fired at all. 9 humans, 1 small ship, and in the space of a heartbeat, they had erased the fighting capability of 7 Sarathi warships without killing a single person. Mwangi's voice came through the channel one more time. It was quiet now, almost gentle. "Commandant Isserul, your escort ships have been disabled. Their crews are alive and unharmed. Life support will be maintained indefinitely. Your flagship remains active because I wanted you to hear this directly." A pause. "We did not want this. We never want this. Every species that enters our space uninvited is given every chance to leave peacefully. You were given the warnings. You were shown the graveyard. You were given the message on your screens. You were shown what we could do to your systems, and you still chose to fire on us." Another pause, longer this time. "But we understand. We understand pride. We understand duty. We understand the fear of going home and facing the consequences of failure. We understand these things because we are not so different from you, Commandant. We are just people who built a fence because someone once took everything from us, and we decided that no one would ever do that again." Mwangi's voice softened even further. "You can still go home. All of you. Every single person in your fleet will be returned to Sarathi space, alive and well. Your ships will be repaired. Your wounded pride will heal. And someday, perhaps, your matriarchy will send an ambassador instead of a warship, and we will welcome them with open arms. That is our hope. That has always been our hope." The channel went quiet. The bridge of the pale silence was still. Every officer stood frozen at their station, staring at their screens, not knowing what to say or do or think. They had just witnessed something that defied every law of warfare they had ever learned. They had fired everything they had at a single small ship, and that ship had not even blinked. Isserul stood at the center of it all, alone in the middle of her bridge, and she looked old, not tired, not defeated, old, as if the last few minutes had aged her by decades, stripping away everything she had believed about herself and her people and her dominion, and leaving behind only a small, frightened creature who had come face to face with something vast and incomprehensible and utterly beyond her ability to fight. Her mandibles clicked once, twice, Then she closed her eyes and her shoulders dropped, and she spoke in a voice so quiet that Talavek could barely hear it. "Stand down. All weapons offline. Bonnie, all systems to passive." The weapons officer obeyed instantly, his relief so obvious it was almost physical. Across the bridge, Talavek saw the same relief in every face. Not joy, not triumph, just the profound, bone-deep gratitude of creatures who had been certain they were about to die and had been given, against all expectation, one more chance to live. The quiet resolve moved for the first time, gliding forward until it hung directly in front of the Pale Silence's bridge viewport. Talavek could see it clearly now, close enough to make out the details of its hull. It was beautiful, in a way that Sarathi ships never were. Elegant, clean, built not to intimidate, but to function, and functioning so well that intimidation was unnecessary. Through one of its small viewports, Talavek caught a glimpse of a figure, a human, one small and soft and fragile by Sarathi standards. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that could have belonged to any of a million unremarkable species. But behind that face was a civilization that had turned its own grief into the most terrible shield the galaxy had ever known. And the thing that made Talavek's heart ache, the thing she would remember for the rest of her life, was that the human at the viewport was smiling, not in triumph, not in cruelty, in sadness, because they had not wanted it to come to this. And it had come to this anyway, the way it always did. The space-time field released, the Sarathi fleet drifted free, and the quiet resolve, still carrying its crew of 9, turned slowly and began to guide them home. Talavek woke in her quarters and did not know where she was. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling, Anna listening to the hum of the ship around her. The sound was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like hearing a song she knew played on an instrument she did not recognize. The engines were running, the air was flowing, the lights were on, everything was normal. Then she remembered, and the weight of it settled over her like a stone. She sat up and checked her personal terminal. The ship's clock told her she had been asleep for 14 hours. That was wrong. She had not meant to sleep at all. The last thing she remembered was standing on the bridge, watching the quiet resolve turn to lead them out of human space. And then, nothing. A gap. As if someone had gently closed a door in her mind and let her rest. She wondered if the humans had done that too. Or if they had reached into the ship's environmental systems and released something into the air, some chemical or frequency that brought sleep, because the crew needed it and the humans had decided they should have it. It was the kind of thing they would do, careful, precise, kind in a way that felt almost frightening, because kindness from something that powerful was harder to understand than cruelty. Talavek dressed and made her way to the bridge. The corridors were quiet but not empty. Crew members moved through the ship in small groups, speaking in low voices, their movements careful and subdued. They had the look of people who had survived something enormous and were still trying to understand what it meant. Some of them nodded to Talavek as she passed. Others did not seem to see her at all, lost in their own thoughts. Their eyes focused on something far away. The bridge was running on a skeleton crew. Half the stations were unmanned, and the officers who remained were watching their instruments with the dazed attentiveness of people who did not quite trust reality anymore. The main display showed the stars ahead, and among those stars, moving with a calm and steady grace, was the quiet resolve. The human ship was leading them home. It moved at a gentle pace, well within the capability of the damaged Sarathi fleet, and behind it, the Pale Silence and its 6 escort ships followed in a loose formation. The escorts were running again. Their systems had been restored, not by Sarathi engineers, but by whatever invisible force the humans had used to shut them down. Every ship was fully functional. Every system was online. Every crew member was alive and unharmed. Nobody had been hurt. That was the part that Talavek kept coming back to. After everything that had happened, after the warnings in the graveyard, and the shutdown, and the weapons fire, and the demonstration of power so vast it made her dizzy to think about, not a single Sarathi had been injured. Not one. The humans had dismantled the fighting capability of an entire fleet and had done it with the care of a parent taking a dangerous toy away from a child. Talvik found Krail standing near the tactical station, his forearms folded across his chest, watching the human ship on the display. "How are the crew?" she asked. "Confused," Krail said. "Scared, relieved. Some of them are angry, but they are not sure who to be angry at." He paused. "Hi, where's the commandant?" "I was about to ask you the same thing." "She is in her quarters. She has been there since—" He gestured vaguely at the display, at the quiet resolve, at everything. "Since it ended. She is not taking communications?" Talvik nodded. She had expected that. Whatever had broken inside Israel on the bridge, when she had watched her fleet go dark and her weapons dissolve into nothing, it was not something that could be repaired with sleep and a few hours of quiet. She went to the commandant's quarters anyway. The door was unlocked, which surprised her. Israel was a private creature who kept her space sealed and secure at all times. Finding the door open felt like finding a wound that had not been bandaged. Talvik entered carefully and found the commandant standing at the far wall, her back to the door, her body very still. "Commandant?" Israel did not turn around. "Come in, Talvik. Close the door." Talvik closed the door and stepped further into the room. It was dim, the lights turned down to their lowest setting, and in the gloom she could see that something was different about the wall that Israel was staring at. There was writing on it, not on a screen or a datapad, on the wall itself, burned into the metal in thin, precise lines, as if someone had used a laser to engrave words directly into the bulkhead. The writing was in Sarathi, not common Sarathi, not the everyday language of soldiers and workers. It was the sacred calligraphy of the High Matriarchy, the formal script that was used only for the most important communications, the language of law and ceremony and ultimate authority. It was a script that took Sarathi scholars decades to master. No alien should have been able to reproduce it. The humans had written it perfectly. Talvik read the words. "We could have erased your fleet in the time it took you to read this sentence. We chose not to. Tell your matriarchy that we will always choose not to, as long as we are given that choice. Take away our choice, and we will take away yours." The words hung there, carved into the wall of the most private room on the ship, in the most sacred script of the Sarathi people. It was a message to Israel, but it was also a message to the matriarchy, delivered in a language and a format that no Sarathi authority could dismiss or ignore. The humans had not just beaten the Sarathi fleet, they had reached into the heart of Sarathi culture and spoken to it directly, in its own voice, shorn with its own words. "They were in my quarters," Israel said quietly, "while I slept, while we all slept. They came aboard, or they sent something aboard, and they wrote this on my wall, in my quarters, on my ship." She turned and Talvik saw her face. It was empty, not angry, not afraid, just empty, like a house that someone had moved out of and left behind. "They could have done anything. They could have killed me. They could have killed all of us. Instead, they wrote a message on my wall in the matriarchy's own hand." "Yes," Talvik said. There was nothing else to say. "Do you understand what that means?" "I think so. It means they are not our enemy. An enemy would have destroyed us. An enemy would have taken our ships and our technology and our people and used them. That is what the Dominion would have done. That is what the Corvati would have done. That is what anyone in the galaxy would have done." Israel's mandibles clicked slowly. "But the humans let us live. They stopped our weapons without hurting us. They shut down our ships without killing anyone. They walked into my private quarters and left a note. A note, Talvik, not a bomb, not a blade, a note." She walked to her chair and sat down heavily, and for the first time Talvik noticed how old the commandant looked, how tired, how small. "I have spent my entire life conquering things," Israel said. "I have burned worlds and shattered fleets and ground civilizations into dust, and I was proud of it. I thought that was strength. I thought that was what strength looked like." She looked at the writing on her wall. "I was wrong. Strength is what they just did. Having the power to destroy us and choosing not to. That is strength. That is something the Sarathi have never understood." Talvik sat down across from the commandant and said nothing for a while. They sat together in the dim room, two soldiers who had gone looking for a fight and found something else entirely, something bigger and stranger and more difficult to understand than any enemy they had ever faced. "What will you tell the matriarchy?" Talvek asked eventually. "The truth," Yisrael said. "All of it. The warnings, the graveyard, the demonstration, the message on my wall. Everything. And I will tell them that if they send another fleet into human space, every ship in that fleet will join the graveyard, and the Sarathi Dominion will follow the Korvathi and the Dreth into history. Not because the humans are monsters, but because the humans made a promise, and they keep their promises." The journey back to the border took 5 days. 5 quiet, strange, surreal days during which the Sarathi fleet followed the tiny human ship through the vast and silent space that everyone in the galaxy had learned to fear. Nothing happened during those 5 days. No more messages, no more demonstrations, no more ghost signatures or system shutdowns or words carved into walls. Just the steady, patient journey of a small ship leading a broken fleet home. The crew spent those days in a kind of daze. Some of them talked endlessly, processing what had happened through repetition, telling and retelling the story to anyone who would listen. Others went silent, retreating into themselves, working through their fear and their awe in private. A few of the younger soldiers gathered in the mess hall in the evenings and talked about the humans with a tone that Talvek had never heard Sarathi use before. Not fear, not hatred, not respect exactly. Something closer to wonder. Krail came to Talvek on the 3rd day and sat beside her in the intelligence office, his scarred carapace looking older than she remembered. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the Korvathi dreadnought. The crew preserved in amber. Their faces. Yes, they were terrified, every one of them. But our crew is not terrified. We are confused. We are shaken. But we are not frozen in fear. Do you know why?" Talvek thought about it. "Because the Korvathi were attacked. We were not." "No," Krail said. "Because the Korvathi were given no chance. The humans destroyed them in 11 minutes, without warning, without mercy. But us, they warned again and again. They showed us the evidence. They took our weapons and gave them back. They shut down our ships and turned them on again. They did everything they could to make us turn around before it went too far." He leaned forward, his old soldier's eyes bright with something that might have been understanding. "The Korvathi entered human space and attacked without hesitation, so the humans responded without hesitation. But we were given chances because the humans saw that some of us wanted to leave. They saw that you wanted to leave. I think maybe they saved our lives because of you, Talvek, because you tried to stop it, and they were watching, and they thought we were worth saving." Talvek did not know what to say to that. She sat with it for a long time after Krail left, turning it over in her mind, trying to understand a species that would go to such extraordinary lengths to avoid killing, even when killing would have been easier, even when it would have been justified. On the 5th day, the buoy perimeter appeared on the sensors. The blinking line of small, blue-lit beacons stretched across their path, broadcasting their eternal warning in 12,000 languages. The quiet resolve slowed and then stopped, floating just inside the line, and the Sarathi fleet drifted to a halt behind it. The communication channel opened one last time. "This is Commander Mwangi of the Quiet Resolve. Commandant Yisrael, your fleet is at the border of human-administered space. The dimensional stabilization field has been fully disengaged. Your ships are free to cross the perimeter and return to Sarathi territory. And all vessels are confirmed functional. All personnel are confirmed healthy." A pause. "I want you to know, Commandant, that I meant what I said. You are not our enemy. None of you are. We take no joy in what happened here, and we hope sincerely that this will be the last time a Sarathi fleet enters our space uninvited. But if it is not the last time, we will be here. We are always here." Another pause, longer and softer. "Safe journey home, all of you." The channel closed. The Quiet Resolve hung motionless for a moment, a small, bright shape against the dark. And then it was gone. Not warped away, not cloaked, just gone, as if it had never been there at all, as if the entire encounter had been a dream shared by 2,000 people. The pale silence crossed the buoy perimeter. The warnings resumed behind them, broadcasting their message to the empty space, patient and eternal. Ahead, the stars of familiar space burned steady and welcoming, and the Sarathi fleet limped home through the dark. Talvek wrote her report that night. She sat at her terminal for hours, staring at the screen, trying to find the words to describe what had happened. She wrote pages and pages and deleted them all. She tried technical language and military jargon and formal diplomatic phrasing, and none of it was right. None of it captured the truth of what she had experienced. In the end, she deleted everything and wrote 3 words: "Do not go." She submitted the report and went to bed. And for the first time since they had crossed the buoy perimeter, she slept without dreaming. The fleet arrived home. Yisrael presented her report to the matriarchy, and the details of what followed were classified at the highest level. But Talvik heard rumors. She heard that the Supreme Mother read Yisrael's report in silence, and then sat alone in her chambers for 3 days. She heard that the inner council debated for a week, and that the debate was the most heated in living memory. She heard that several counselors argued for a full military assault on human space, and that those counselors were silenced when Yisrael played the sensor recordings of 6 warships being switched off in a single heartbeat by a vessel crewed by 9 people. The matriarchy did not send another fleet. Instead, 2 years later, they sent an ambassador. The humans welcomed her with open arms. 50 years passed. The Sarathi Dominion and the United Earth Nations signed a formal alliance. Trade routes were established, where cultural exchanges began. Sarathi scholars traveled to Earth and studied human art, in music and literature, and came back with a new understanding of a species that painted pictures and wrote songs and built gardens, a species that loved beauty as deeply as it loved strength. Human engineers visited Sarathi worlds and marveled at the architecture, at the intricate hive cities that rose toward the sky like living cathedrals. And the 2 species found, to their mutual surprise, that they had far more in common than they had ever expected. Sarathi larvae enrolled in human universities. Human children learned the clicking, complex Sarathi language and thought it was wonderful fun. Joint research projects produced advances in science and medicine that neither species could have achieved alone. The border buoys still broadcast their warnings, but now there was a second message alongside them, in Sarathi and human, and a dozen other languages that said, "Friends of humanity are welcome here." Talvek Oran became a diplomat. She spent her later years traveling between Sarathi and human worlds, building the bridges that her younger self had been sent to burn. She learned to speak human languages, several of them, and she found that the sounds felt strange in her mandibles, but the meanings felt right in her hearts. She never forgot the pale silence. She never forgot the graveyard or the frozen weapons fire, or the message on Israel's wall. She carried those memories with her like scars, and she used them, every day, to remind herself and everyone around her that peace was not weakness, and mercy was not surrender, and the strongest thing a species could do was choose not to destroy something it could easily destroy. Yisrael retired from military service and spent her final years tending a garden on her homeworld. She grew plants from a dozen worlds, including Earth, and she spent her evenings sitting among them, listening to the wind, thinking about a small ship called the Quiet Resolve, and a human woman who had spoken to her with kindness, while holding the power to erase her from existence. When she died, she was buried in that garden, and Talvek planted a human rose on her grave. Commander Alara Mwangi continued to serve aboard the Quiet Resolve for another decade before transferring to the diplomatic corps. Now she and Talvek met in person for the first time at a peace conference on a neutral station, and Talvek, who had spent years preparing for that meeting, who had rehearsed a dozen different things she wanted to say, looked into Mwangi's warm brown eyes and found that she could only say one thing. "Thank you for letting us go home." Mwangi smiled. "Thank you for going home," she said. "Not everyone does." They became friends after that. Close friends. The kind of friends who could sit together in comfortable silence and understand each other without speaking, which was appropriate, because both of them knew the value of silence better than most. On the last night of Talvek's life, many years later, she gave a lecture at the Galactic Assembly. She was very old by then, her carapace thin and pale, her movements slow and careful. But her mind was sharp, and her voice was clear, and when she stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled delegates from 100 species, She felt the same thing she had felt on the bridge of the Pale Silence all those years ago. Not fear, not awe, understanding. She spoke for an hour. She told the whole story, the warnings, the graveyard, the shutdown, the tiny ship and its crew of 9, the message on the wall, the choice. She told it simply and honestly, without exaggeration or drama, because the truth did not need embellishment. It was big enough on its own. When she finished, a young delegate from a species she did not recognize raised a hand. "Ambassador Orion," the young one said, "you have spent more time with humans than almost any non-human alive. You know them better than most of us ever will. So I must ask, what are the humans really like?" Talvek looked at the young delegate. She looked at the assembly. She looked at the vast window behind the podium, where the stars burned in the dark, and somewhere among them, in a quiet corner of the spiral arm, the warning boys still blinked their patient blue light. She thought about Alara Mwangi's smile. She thought about the human rose growing on Israel's grave. She thought about the Karen colony and the cold, terrible decision that humanity had made in its grief. She thought about the graveyard and the amber-preserved faces of the Korvathi and the words carved into a wall in sacred script by a species that could have carved them into the fabric of reality itself. And she clicked her mandibles softly and said, "They are the kindest beings in the galaxy. And that is precisely why you should pray you never give them a reason to stop being kind." The assembly was quiet for a long time after that, and somewhere far away, in the silence between the stars, the warning boys continued to broadcast, patient and eternal, speaking in 12,000 languages, reminding the galaxy of a simple truth that every species eventually learned. No one enters human space uninvited, not unless they never wanted to return at all, and the humans wait in their silence, not because they want to fight, but because they remember what it costs them to learn that some things are worth fighting for. And they will wait forever if they have to. Patient and kind and terrible and gentle, ready to welcome anyone who comes in peace, and ready, always ready for those who do not.